Welcome back, Akira Bike Project fans. We left off the last video with cleaning up the CX500 engine here and building this test stand and getting the engine up on the start of this test stand. With that, let's move on to disassembly. I basically followed the guides over at motofaction.org, which I'll link in the description of this video. This really won't be an in-depth, deep dive teardown and rebuild since there are already many of those on YouTube, but more of an overview of the highlights. With that, I started out by removing the front transmission cover. With the transmission cover removed, I would inspect and replace the alignment dowels, the metering jet, and O-rings for the front cover, as well as inspect and replace if necessary the oil pump and oil pump screen. The dowels and oil pump screen all looked pretty good, but I did go ahead and replace the O-rings. I moved on to the rear of the engine next. Before I could get the rear cover off, I first had to remove the impeller, which pumps the coolant through the cylinder heads. I removed the numerous bolts that hold the rear cover on, and would go ahead and inspect the dowels and the O-rings for the rear cover as well. The rear engine cover, having been in place for approximately 40 years, would take some gentle but persistent and persuasive coaxing with a rubber mallet to remove. With a satisfying, it finally gave way. Next, I would inspect the cam chain tensioner, which keeps this chain that drives the cams, which open and close the valves, nice and tight. Looks pretty good actually, with still some room for adjustment above the bolt. Back on that rear cover is the CDI stator, which generates about 170 watts at 5,000 RPM. Looking pretty good, but if I want to pack more electronic devices into this bike, I may want to upgrade this at some point to the charge-only stator that can put out 250 watts. Next up was the cylinder head cover, which comes off quite easily. The rocker arm holder and assembly would come off next. These bolts were a bit stubborn to remove. Next would be the cylinder heads themselves. These house the valves and the air fuel and exhaust channels and sit directly on top of the piston. They were particularly difficult to remove without damaging anything and required much more rubber mallet persuasion. I learned a trick later to remove the spark plug, rotate the crank so the piston is at the bottom of its travel, and drop a thick rope in there. Then turn the crank. The rope gets squeezed as the piston travels up the cylinder and pops the cylinder head right off. I haven't tried it yet, but sounds pretty reasonable. I moved on next to cleaning the mating surfaces of the parts. Here the rear cover is out. I put a cloth on it, protecting the central parts from debris that may come from the cleaning, and I spray the surface with a solvent repeatedly and start scraping, rubbing, peeling, brushing, etc., avoiding damaging the surface itself. It's a decent amount of meticulous work, but eventually the surfaces come out pretty good. And next up was the front engine cover. Again, I carefully removed the old gasket using solvent and gentle abrasives. You generally want to avoid using hard brushes or abrasives that are harder than the underlying metal or continually shed debris. I had a heck of a time getting the clutch cover off the front engine plate and ended up having to put it in my pneumatic press. I moved extremely slowly until it just barely popped off. I cleaned those surfaces up before moving back over to the heads. It was the same procedure on the engine head gasket surfaces, with quite a bit of extra elbow grease. The gaskets here are exposed to the high temperatures of combustion. I had trouble getting the hollow alignment dowels out too, but figured out if they put a drill bit inside them that's just slightly smaller, you can safely clamp them with vice grips for removal. They certainly looked pretty good after cleaning. With the cylinder heads, valve cover, clutch cover, and engine front cover surfaces all cleaned, I moved back to the engine block. Again, I filled the open areas with towels and cloth to limit debris getting into the engine. That carbon soot cleaned off the piston heads quite nicely, and the whole thing looked almost like new afterwards. I moved on next to preparing all these parts for painting. Every part was degreased again with an engine degreaser and scrubbing in a hot bath, and then cleaned with simple green and a thorough hot water washing. I started out here with this piece, the oil filter cover. It turns out that these engines have a gray coating of paint that closely matches the color of cast aluminum. So after the thorough cleaning, the next step was to spray paint remover and scrub the paint off of each piece. I then sanded each piece with a 320 grit abrasive plastic Dremel brush, which worked pretty good at removing the aluminum corrosion and giving it an almost polished, smooth look. I gave the clutch cover with a nice Honda logo a similar treatment, but also using some sandpaper and a flapper disc. And next up was the front engine cover, going through the cleaning, the paint peeling, brushing, and sanding. And then the rear engine cover, which needed some extra care, taping off a few parts and holes, and doing the paint removal in a few different stages. The main engine block had more preparation with taping and covering internals with cloth and plastic to protect it from the cleaning materials. But this made degreasing and cleaning easier since I couldn't put the block in the sink for washing. I had to wash it right on the workbench. Paint stripping was a little more delicate, mostly using a brush instead of spray-on paint stripper. And I wheeled the engine outside for a final rinsing with the power washer too. With that, the main engine block was ready for painting. The engine heads went through the same process of taping, cleaning, stripping, and sanding. However, I ran into this issue with the left head that had this nice broken bolt that I had to try to figure out how to remove. I decided to try welding a washer to it and then welding a nut to the washer. A couple of tack welds with the MIG gun did the job with the washer. I welded the nut to the washer, but it broke right off the second I tried to use it. I tried clamping vice grips directly to the washer, and that actually worked just fine, so all was good and I got the bolt out. The last major piece of the engine was the cylinder head cover. I decided I wouldn't be painting this though, instead I would try to polish them. This would take a lot of sanding to start, by hand and using abrasive wheels and wire brushes on the Dremel, and then moving on to polishing wheels. The cylinder head cover on your right here was sanded up to 400 grit with sandpaper and brushes. The cylinder head here on the left, after being sanded up to 400, was polished using Tripoli and white diamond compounds. And man, did those come out looking fantastic or what? I was really impressed with how those came out. I moved on next to painting the engine. I built this quick temporary paint booth with some cardboard and a fluorescent light and a rotary table. I settled on VHT's cast iron black for the color, and I started here with the oil filter cover again. The process involves quite a few steps. I first started with a good thorough wipe down of the part with acetone. After the thorough cleaning with the acetone, I start with some base layers of an acid etching primer. This is a primer that helps paint stick to smooth metal surfaces. I did 3 coats with this green acid etching primer, giving about 10 or 15 minutes between coats for the paint layer to get tacky but not quite dry yet. When spray painting, you want to do a sweeping motion across the part, starting the spray before you start crossing over the part, and stopping after the spray leaves the part. This avoids the spatter that starting and stopping the spray can causes. Combining that with my Lazy Susan rotary table here with a slow spinning motion gave a nice, even, thorough coat to the part. After those 3 acid etch primer layers dried, I gave the part a quick hit with 340 to 400 grit abrasive wheel or sandpaper. This is just a light scuffing and gives the subsequent layers of paint more to grab onto. I then moved on to the VHT cast iron black and repeated the same process. I did 3 layers of this as well, with also about a 10 to 20 minute wait between layers to let the layer get a little bit tacky before adding the subsequent layer to it. And finally I did 3 glossy clear coats to protect the underlying paint finish and to give it a nice glossy sheen. And the results were fantastic. I was amazed with how good that came out, especially when you compare it to the original part. It just looks stunning now, and it's hard to believe this is a 40-plus-year-old engine. I repeated the same process with the clutch cover, which came out looking amazing, and then the whole front cover to the engine. And putting those 3 pieces together, we have the whole engine front cover assembly. And wow, yeah, it is looking fantastic. I did the same with the rear cover as well. In these parts, all the accessory holes and mounts and ports are masked off as well. And then I did the right and left cylinder heads using the same process. And then all the accessory components and covers. And of course last I did the engine block itself. And with that I started reassembling the engine. I bought this nice polished bolt kit for the CX500, and of course new gaskets and O-rings for the entire engine. With all those parts painted and the engine reassembled, let's show off how it came out. Well, that is it for this update. I hope you all enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments what you think of that engine rebuild. I was honestly shocked at how nice that came out. And going through the significant preparation and the 9 separate layers of paint really made me appreciate the effort that goes into these nice paint jobs. I'd like to welcome and thank our newest patron, Kelly S. Kelly, thank you for your patronage. That is awesome. Deeply appreciate it. Every bit helps here, and it is definitely appreciated. If you like this project, please consider becoming a patron. It really helps accelerate things and moves this project along. Thank you all. See you all soon.